Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of August 5th, the year 2023. I'm Michael James, and regular listeners to this show know that we've had people talking about Cuba over the years. We had the late, great Pat Gleason on. We've had Marguerite Horberg talking about trips to Cuba, cultural trips, and artists that she's brought. And, she is the director of Hot House, and they have a new locations that we'll talk more about in the future. I've been to Cuba a couple times, and actually my new book, Crossing Borders, has a lot of photos from Cuba on my 2 trips there. But each week I get an email from an old friend of mine, Lincoln Bergman, and it's from Freedom Archives. And they talked about the Moncada Barracks and the 26th of July movement in Cuba. And I thought, well, that was last week. It's not too late. Let's get Lincoln on. And he's brought along his friend, Claude Marks, and they're going to share a little bit of information about Cuba and the 70th anniversary of the Moncada raid. And we'll also talk about Freedom Archives. And then we'll hear a poem from Lincoln about Cuba. So, good morning to you, gentlemen. How are you? Or good morning, afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time.
It's morning. We're in Berkeley, California. Claude is actually the director of the Freedom Archives, and several others are co-founders. And since 1999, 2000, the Freedom Archives started first in San Francisco, and now we're in Berkeley after 23 years. Claude and I have been to Cuba a fair amount. I've been 3 times. I think Claude has been quite a bit more. So glad to talk about it and to mark the 70th anniversary of the attack on the Moncada Barracks.
Well, Cuba's a wonderful place. I really loved it the times I've been. We used to bring the band Mescla here after the Bush years or before the Bush years, when we could bring the band in. And I like to follow Cuba. So why don't you guys fill us in on the historic date of the 70th anniversary of July 26th, what went on and what you see going on in Cuba today?
Well, July 26, 1953 was an attack on the second largest fortress of the Batista tyranny. And Fulgencio Batista was a terrible, brutal tyrant, completely under the control of U.S. empire, the U.S. imperialism, but just horrendous and hated in Cuba, the Batista regime. And this was the second largest fortress of Batista tyranny. There was quite a lot of, a protest, student protest. Fidel Castro was a student and a law student. They organized a movement. They organized clandestinely to attack on July 26, 1953, this fortress in Santiago, Cuba, a very beautiful city, sort of like San Francisco, looking out over the sea on the eastern far end of Cuba. And it was done secretly. It was the days of Carnival in Santiago, Cuba. So it provided a way to sort of operate under the wire. Some of them opened up an alleged chicken farm outside Santiago, though the guy across the street across the road liked them a lot, but didn't see any chickens. Nonetheless, they were getting ready, whatever arms they could get, and they had the attack. The attack was carried out there and in another smaller fortress in Bayamo, and it failed miserably for any number of reasons. Some of it was miscommunication. Some of it was moving too early. Fidel later said the forces were divided and so on. So many, more than 100 people attacked the Moncada Barracks, and many were killed, either there or more killed and tortured in prison afterwards. And that is, Fidel was imprisoned. There were 2 women, Aide Santa Maria and Melba Hernandez, that were part of it. They were in prison and others were in prison. There was torture and so on. This is later on, there was a few years later, there was a pardon. Fidel was able to get out. They went to Mexico, took the Granma boat over to Cuba and launched the revolution, which eventually succeeded. So they see Moncada, they talk about it as a setback that led into victory. And it was essentially the catalyst, the spark that led to the Cuban Revolution. and it's now the 70th anniversary. It took place in 1953.
Let me just throw in here a little odd thing. When I was in Cuba, I think the first time in '91, I went to the Museum of the Revolution, and they had I believe it was a 1947 Pontiac Fastback that was used in the raid on Moncada Barracks.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, no, to visit.
That was quite a museum, I got to say. Talk about oppression, talk about shackles and chains. They showed all the stuff.
Yeah, to visit there is very moving because now, in addition to a museum in Santiago, there's a primary school. So the flowers of the revolution, I once said in a poem, grow now in Moncada after that terrible setback.
Well, what's your sense of it? Since you guys have been traveling there, what's your sense of where things are at? I got an email from Pablo Menendez, who brought the band Mescla to the States over and over. He grew up in Berkeley, his mother's Bart, Maine, and he sent me an article about Cubans coming to the United States who are eligible for a lot of retirement money, and not a lot of money, but they do get a stipend every month. And, most of those people said they liked Cuba, but they got a little more money, and in their old age, they came here. What's your take on where the Cuban Revolution is at, some of the challenges, some of the good things going on, and how people might contact their elected representatives to get a better deal for the Cuban people and our relationship with Cuba?
Well, we were just there recently doing some work with the Literacy Museum. The Literacy Museum, by the way, is where the history of this massive campaign is, where once the Cuban Revolution triumphed, they mobilized literate youth to go throughout the island to, within under 2 years, transform the ability of people, particularly in rural areas, to read and write, thinking that the premise is you can't really have an engaged and democratic process politically as long as people aren't able to function in a literate way. So this was a number one priority. Anyway, we were there doing some work with them. The conditions in Cuba are particularly challenging in a period like this because of the history of the embargo by the United States, which is an attempt to increase the suffering of the population with the idea that it will rebel against the government and the leadership and the direction set forth over the last years. The reality, however, while the conditions are very challenging, they're all, and people are not happy about this, the ability to more readily feed people or engage in global trade, or the shortage of gasoline to power buses and trucks, to make food distribution something attainable. All of these things are impacted by the United States trying to derail the ability of Cuba to survive. Despite that, and despite the fact that some people are able to leave because of the economic conditions, not because they hate what Cuba is, there's a tremendous kind of level of nascent resistance that are very broadly experienced there. We stayed in a very simple place, ate what the workers ate, walked to work every day when we went, to really get a sense of an immersed experience that wasn't based on hotels and tourism. And we really felt strongly that the level of unity and the understanding of what the source of the challenge to the Cuban population, that being the United States-led embargo, that's a very universal feeling with all the complaints that exist. There's universal free education, nobody's starving, You don't see homeless encampments like you do in the United States. You know, people's quality of life in terms of their health is far better and exceeds that of the United States, even though they're denied the benefits of getting ibuprofen, for example. Something fairly basic. So when you go there, and we brought like a suitcase of essentially medical supplies with us when we went, because, you know, we didn't want to show up totally empty-handed. And, you know, this is a consistent feature of what solidarity travel to Cuba looks like. And despite that, you know, as a nation globally, they send medical professionals to hundreds of countries in the world and are able to respond to natural disaster in a way that's totally unprecedented, despite the fact that you know, the internal conditions are challenging. So it's something pretty amazing as a contribution to the global well-being, if you will, that this attempt to create a socialist society, an egalitarian and a just world, that Cuba makes that contribution, even though, you know, the United States at every conceivable turn is trying to isolate them and destroy what's been built.
Am I correct that Cuba, you talked about the literacy campaigns, that they now have the highest literacy rate in the Western Hemisphere?
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very high. Yes, it's very
It's like
high.
97%.
Yeah.
It's higher than the United States.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
we're going down in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah. The Freedom Archives has had a long-standing connection with Cuba in various ways. Not long after Claude and I first met at KPFA in Berkeley, the Pacifica station, we did a program together called The Real Dragon. But not after several years of that, I was invited to work at Radio Havana, Cuba, which I did for a year. So I learned a lot about Cuba there. And then later on, the Freedom Archives has made different productions, CDs and videos and so on. And we made a film. Claude led in making a film, COINTELPRO 101. And that appeared at the Havana Film Festival, a very famous, beautiful film festival. And we've been there many times. So that's a connection that the Freedom Archives has with Cuba, and a long-standing one. And one, as Claude said, he and Nathaniel Moore, the other co-director, just went to Cuba in the last couple of months to help with the Literacy Museum.
When you were there, I mean, has tourism started to pick up again at all? Or is it still just, you know, they were counting on tourism. It kind of forced into it, you know, and I've been seeing shows on TV, documentaries kind of on wildlife in Cuba, and there are animals and insects and birds that are nowhere else. So there was a cranking up of the tourist industry for a while. But I think that the COVID, along with the, you know, the U.S.'s embargo, has really hit that. True or no?
Well, yeah, of course, COVID impacted, and they made decisions to, you know, essentially protect their own population. They also developed their own COVID vaccines,
Yeah.
and inoculated the entire population, so that, in fact, the impact of COVID in Cuba, you know, was far less than the more developed parts of the Western Hemisphere or Europe or the world, for that matter. So, you know, this is part of their kind of their prowess medically includes a huge biotech sector that successfully created vaccines that in turn were shared with other parts of the world, that in a lot of ways were equally, if not more effective than those developed by the United States.
And I think tourism has started to pick up again in recent days.
Somewhat,
yeah.
but not
to the level it was.
Not to the level that it was when we were there last.
Let me follow up on that. You mentioned that you guys had met while doing a show, The Real Dragon, at KPFA. KPFA, as I recall, is a public station in Berkeley.
The Pacifica station, yeah, public radio station, yeah.
Tell us about how you guys met.
Well, I got hired at some point in 1969 to be news director at KPFA. And there I am, and all of a sudden it's a baptism of fire. People's Park breaks out. There's a National Guard in the streets, there's demonstrations, there's a man killed, others wounded. Claude was a student at UC Berkeley who had come to KPFA to be a volunteer and then became a reporter out on the streets. A great reporter, great eyes. So he was out there in the streets, roaming around, telling everybody, bringing it to a lot of live programming. I was inside the station, and that's how we met during that time. After several years at KPFA, I was news director no more. Claude became production director and was a great production director at KPFA, and we stayed close. And we started the KPFA news department couldn't do their news on the weekend. We started a Saturday night news program, and it was called The Real Dragon. That comes from Ho Chi Minh. When the prison doors are opened, the real dragon will fly out. And we've been talking a lot about what we did on that show. It was news, it was commentary, it was poetry, it was music, and it was sound mixed together in the way we tried to sum up what had happened that week in a kind of an aesthetic way. And we did a weekly show, and those programs are one of the beginnings of what's in the Freedom Archives. We have almost all of those programs on tape, on reel-to-reel tape, as you can see the tape recording stuff behind us. And then other shows followed. Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom.
Freedom is a constant.
Freedom is a constant struggle. The old civil rights slogan began until the mid-90s. So we have weekly shows from that time. And we also work very closely with the Third World Department at KPFA. And we have great Latino and other related programming here in the Freedom Archives too. So that was a start, but the Freedom Archives has grown tremendously since that start. Maybe Claude could say something more about some of the other collections and projects that Freedom Archives has done and is doing.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that. And I just want to, I don't mean to be pushing my own stuff too much, but I do want to say that if you guys are ever interested in the Live from the Heartland show, we've been doing it for 20 years. We have a lot of them on video. They're up every week at youtube.com. And, we'd love to have some of them included with you guys. Just throwing that out there.
I hear that. That's great.
So over the years, we've gathered programming that is largely audio, but also some video. That's a product of a number of different collective groups that come together initially in the 70s. We've also acquired material from people that probably aren't remembered or known, but like a Colin Edwards, who was a Welsh nationalist, very much about challenging the nature of the British Empire and the United States, who's fortunately very dedicated to covering things like the Black Panther Party, the Palestinian struggle, worked to make a living by producing programs for the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting, but who lived in Berkeley. So while I was a teenager, I started being one of his tech support people. And through many years and long-term relationship, after I come back, it turns out Colin has passed, and the family is insistent that his body of work not be housed in an institution of education because of the conservative nature of what they are thrilled at the opportunity that we acquire his entire body of work. So that's typical of how we've approached acquiring additional material.
And we have lots of documents now, pamphlets, leaflets, and all that kind of thing that from that period of time.
Are you limited to a certain period of time, or are you going to expand it and keep going on up closer to the present?
Our expertise is focused starting with the 60s and probably through the 80s. And, we have all that we can do to keep up with, the influx of that kind of material. And there's a lot of people that, particularly with the web and the ability to archive things on the cloud, that are really taking care of the current period. So we're sticking to what we do well and what's unique in that sense.
And we've made programs from the materials we have, updated them, so on. I mentioned COINTELPRO 101, the film, a lot of things on political prisoners as well, on the Chicano movement. If people go to freedomarchives.org, they can see a lot of what we do. If they see a pamphlet or something that's interested them, many of them are downloadable PDFs and so on. So that's a good thing to go. We can check out all of our programs. There's been many. Some are audio, some are video, like I said.
Is there competition for archival material? I'm in on this group of early SDS people, Students for Democratic Society. And there are some people, particularly out of Austin or out of the South, who have been encouraging people to take their papers or whatever they've got and donate them to the Briscoe archives at the University of Texas. I'm here in Chicago by DePaul University, which has a Young Lords organization, some Panther stuff, some of the Rising Up Angry. I'm just wondering, there's a active movement for many years. There's a lot of people got a lot of information. Are people in the archival world going after people with the stuff? Are they cooperating, sharing?
Well, a lot of this history gets commodified by institutions that are endowed, that have money to acquire things.
Yeah.
We're intentionally community-based. We don't have the kind of barriers that these large institutions have for access. We work extensively with young people and encourage the repurposing of this material, which is very different than what it takes to get into a private university's archival system. So in that sense, we're trying to stay more true to the intent of the creation of these materials in the first place.
And we work cooperatively with other radical archives, of course, around the country.
But we don't.
What are some of those other radical archives?
Well, there's the Interference Archive that's in New York, which is a progressive place. There's the Southern California Library in Los Angeles. Those are just a couple of examples. Yeah. All of these places are more independent. They're not institutionally tied to major universities that, have, they may want to acquire things and they may have the means of doing it, but later down the road, it can be far more challenging in terms of access.
Well, we're going to run out of time, and I want to get Lincoln's poem in.
I also have enough time.
We'll make it. I also wanted to, before I go any further, I just want to remind Lincoln that, I'm just going to tell you, it was your dad who took me to China Books sometime after the free speech movement. I don't know if it was before or after I met you, but he took me to China Books, where I got my first set of Mao books.
That's big. No, my father was a very active, brilliant guy, as you know. glad to hear that story.
Okay, one more time, how people go to the Freedom Archives, how they maybe can get a hold of you, and then Lincoln, read us a poem.
So it's freedomarchives.org, real simple.
That's the way to do it. And the poem is The Night Before Moncada. The night before, the night before, the night before Moncada. How did you, who were there, prepare? Did not fear rise inside your stomach, spread to your head with all the strength it gains when you know tomorrow you may be dead? The night before, the night before, the night before Moncada. Did not your eyes and mine perceive reality with the immense intensity of the kind only freed when human beings meet with historic destiny? You were there in Santiago secretly, in the restaurant, eating with a few other comrades. Days of carnival, of masked costume festivity, days of carnival. You were there in Santiago secretly eating in the restaurant. At other tables, people sat and talked and laughed. The tree of liberty, life moving on in Santiago, good and evil, hate and love, the sea below, the stars above, Santiago de Cuba, life with a few who loan, many who have to borrow, life with all its joy and sorrow. The other people eating in the restaurant did not know what you would do tomorrow. How many maybe agents of Batista do you see? No, it can't be. Fears about security, a cry, a shout, trying not to nervously look all about. The night before, what did you and your comrades talk about? The night before, in a cheap hotel room, the next morning, coming so soon, sounds of Santiago night, thin walls, voices from the next room, thin walls could not dilute the argument between a man and a prostitute. On that night, what a heavy impression it made, the argument about how much she should be paid. In slavery and sorrow, the other people did not know what you would do tomorrow. The night before, Moncada, did you not wonder too if it was the wisest thing to do? Doubts can't be blindly stamped out, rather thought about, analyzed, and debated. Contingencies anticipated. Doubts can't be blindly stamped out, rather thought about, carefully struggled out. The people of our land live in misery, degradation and corruption, terror of tyranny. Listen to their cries. The people of this land shall surely rise. The revolutionary struggle is in the world, in Cuba and in Santiago. That is true. The revolutionary struggle also takes place in you. It's not as though you haven't thought it through before. It just gets more and more. You have agreed to join Freedom Conspiracy because of so much that you knew before, your love for life and people, a comrade's grip, your hatred of oppression and this dictatorship. Perhaps a patriotic song or any unsung melody runs through your brain. What can be done to prepare for pain? Perhaps some lines from revolutionaries of the past, the ones you love, the faces that you see, the tree of liberty, your family. It's not as though you haven't thought it through before. It just gets more and more. The future, present, and the past at last, another clear, courageous inner light born of struggle, resolves to do its best in freedom fight. It just gets more and more. Real people in real liberation war. The night before, Moncada.
That's really nice. And I want to thank you. When did you write that, Lincoln?
I wrote it after my first visit to Cuba in an underground press trip in 1971, and I went to Moncada, and very moving. I wrote a Cantos de Cuba, 60 pages about Cuba, but that one stands out, The Night Before Moncada.
Well, I want to thank both of you brothers for coming on the Live from the Heartland show. I'm hoping to get to the West Coast sooner or later. And if you guys are ever in Chicago, you know where you can find some company.
Absolutely.